Wow, what a lovely turnout. Thank you so much, everyone here at CAM, and this invitation to come out to Houston tonight to give a lecture. I have to say, it's auspicious being here at this time. You guys have something to prove for the rest of the country. So I hope everyone here votes. That's the right of everyone, right? So if there is someone you know who can't make it to the polls or feels like they can't do it that day, or get them to vote early, but it's really, really in this democracy that we are trying to hold on to, that everyone takes that opportunity to vote. I'm going to go through a kind of range of the works that I have been making, I guess, like over the past 20, 30 years, or 25 years. And what's interesting, you know, as an artist and now looking back, and when I kind of don't give as many lectures as often because I kind of needed a break from them. But some of the themes of my work, which Dean pointed to, which have to do with gender and sexuality, race, and particularly kind of those structures in the United States, a lot of those issues are back on the table. And not that they were ever off the table, but certainly when I look back at my work and the things that meant a lot to me as a young woman, kind of defining what I thought of the world that I was living in and what I thought possible, is still a battleground this very moment. So in reviewing that work, I wish that I was more in the position to say, like, yeah, and this is the older work that I did on this, but this is no longer a kind of groundbreaking or, what's the word that I want? An issue that is pertinent today, and so much of it is so pertinent. So I'm going to try to use this pointer. Yay. It works. So a lot of the work that I did came out of photography and came out of going very overtrained education. I went to art high school in New York. I went to summers in Chicago at the Art Institute as a child while I was visiting my grandmother as a small child, and then the School of Visual Arts in New York and the University of California, San Diego. So I do not know of an educational experience that does not have anything to do with art. I've been immersed in that my entire life. And photography was the medium of choice for me in the beginning as a way to think about the world, the way to travel in it, whether that meant taking pictures while I was in undergraduate school and kind of traveling throughout Europe and North Africa, or the streets of Brooklyn or Queens or in Manhattan, that really was a vehicle to kind of experiencing the world without boundaries, but also a way for me to think about the world that I lived in, but also to think about how people thought about photography and kind of what a viewer wanted to get from it, what they kind of would read from a photograph. And that, after spending while I was in undergraduate school and traveling and actually exhibiting work that was more documentary style, I kind of realized that this is really interesting. Everybody's going to kind of read my work when in group shows with other photographers who kind of have the same kind of work with the same kind of mechanism. So meaning you have the subject and, you know, in some way about the juxtaposition of the way the frame is composed and objects in relationship to the subject or to the person pictured would then kind of reveal some kind of narrative that was intended by the photographer. And in watching that as an artist and watching the responses to, not so much to my work, but to the exhibitions, made me start to think that, oh, that's interesting. There's something here that's missing, that because in some ways my photographs and then the photographs by Bruce Davidson were kind of read exactly the same in terms of the purpose of authorship. And I thought there was a problem with that, or at least in terms of my authorship as an artist, there was a problematic there. So then I got out of college early and decided that I wanted to just think for a moment, which meant doing graphic design for different companies in New York as a freelancer, back when there was no digital way of doing that, which was very painstaking and slow. But it really kind of, New York winters doing graphic design, I guess in the 80s, was kind of lonely activity. And then I kind of, through other photographers, met Carrie Mae Weems, and she said to me, so what are you doing? I was like, I'm doing, this graphic design job, it's okay. I kind of would work jobs and then quit them and then travel and make art, and then that was kind of my routine. And she said, well, what about graduate school? And I kind of, as a hardcore New Yorker, I was like, what do you mean graduate school for art? She goes, yeah, San Diego. I was like, really? She goes, yeah, it's a half an hour from Mexico. And I said, yeah. She goes, and there's a beautiful beach. I was like, okay. So she's like, go to CAA and like meet, the administrators, if you're interested. So I did. I knew nothing about the school. All I knew, it was a half an hour from Tijuana, perhaps Rosarito, and that La Jolla and Del Mar were beautiful. And like from the perspective in the middle of the winter of New York, I was like, I could do that. It's a 2-year program. I could do that. And all my friends were like, oh my God, how can you leave New York? I mean, you can't leave New York. Like as though I was going away for a 5-year appointment somewhere, But it was an interesting, it too was a very isolating experience. And I kind of, when I teach now, or kind of as a visiting artist, and before graduate students are always complaining how undiverse the program is, or like nobody understands their work, I'm like, that's what it is. And it probably will always be so because these programs are so small. But on the other hand, it is an opportunity to think. It's an opportunity to get off of the treadmill of figuring out how one is making a living with regards to day-to-day, either a living with regards to one's work or making a living doing other things. And so while I really treasure that, I always see education as this opportunity for free thinking and to create your own universe in a way of support in your own head, I think is very necessary, because once you leave there, you learn how to create families, and you learn how to create that kind of support by people who are like-minded or who are supportive of what you do. And that doesn't always happen in school. So coming out of that kind of art school experience, and during that time, I kind of created these photographic works where they're very starkly, much like this piece, Water Bearer, that there's a figure and you don't see the figure's face. And my attempt was really to get a viewer to take away all these details that you might enjoy in kind of photographic work that is more documentary, which is the facial expression, the relationship to another person in the frame or to objects, and kind of just spare it down that you just have a bare number of details in order to kind of think through, well, what is this photograph of and about and who? And that you can't rely on kind of a set paradigm of assumptions as to what's happening, or even in the way that you read it, or the facial expression, or something about the clothes or class, kind of ripping all those things away in order for you to consider something else. So this reads, which hopefully you all can see, but she saw him disappear by the river. They asked her to tell what happened, only to discount her memory. And so in a lot of my work, memory is a kind of key theme or subject that kind of runs through it, and runs through it in a way of how delicate memory can be, how, in this particular time, how testimony is so poignant, but can also be completely discounted. And so for me, this thing of one's personal voice, but also personal experience and also witnessing becomes this kind of interesting thread that I kind of repeat throughout the work. So in thinking of Water Bearer, it then came, out of San Diego came all this work that's kind of within this format. And so I worked with other artists when I returned to New York. All these images are of a woman named Alva Rogers, who is a performance artist and actress and songwriter. And we kind of trade photographs, like, oh, I'll take a picture for your next show, but can you like pose for me for this thing? So there was a lot of trading back and forth of images in order to have people who, in proximity, my closest friends, in a way, to pose for me. This is 20 Questions, a sampler. which is a parlor game of like a turn-of-the-century parlor game where you have to guess the subject by a number of questions that kind of, if you can guess right, then you kind of get, by process of elimination, what the subject is. Is she as pretty as a pitcher, or clear as crystal, or pure as a lily, or black as cold, or sharp as a razor? So there's all these cliches about the way that you would speak about someone's personality, or how to address their appearance, or their skin color, or their attitude in a way. But in asking those questions or using those cliches, what falls flat is that there is not much known. Like, the subject really isn't known because it's all cloaked in cliche. Oops, wrong way. Another, this is a Polaroid piece called Stereo Styles, made in 1988. And using, for the text, advertising verbiage from women's products. Daring, sensible, severe, long and silky, boyish, ageless, silly, magnetic, country fresh, and sweet. And again, means nothing in a way. And so having kind of this figure with all these different hairstyles as opposing, assuming that you could kind of match a hairstyle or an appearance with a particular kind of cliche. Again, kind of, it's this veil of substitute for a kind of real personality or an actual person. And that many of the times, or as the work kind of goes forward, that this thing of the way that we, either through profiling or either through prejudice or through poor assumptions or ways of thinking about people and what you assume isn't always right. And so with that, there is this, particularly I feel for people of color, like this barrier, which is one's private life and then one's public life. Because the moment you step outside any door comes a whole host of different assumptions and intrusions that one basically has no control over. And this one is Guarded Conditions, which is almost a life-size figure. The bottom text goes back and forth between skin attacks and sex attacks in 1989. So yeah, subject is fairly familiar now, is it not? Figure 1991. So there would also, with these figures with their backs turned to the audience or to the viewer, figured the worst, figured on all the times there was no camera. He was disfigured, figured there was no reaction, figured legality had nothing to do with it, figured she was suspect, figured he was suspect, figured someone had been there because the door was open. So again, it's this public and private lives. So, and in some ways it also, I think as an artist, when I am in the 80s and the 90s, in critiques of my work or kind of in trying to have conversations about what the work is about, I would always be approached like, so, as a black woman, I mean, can you really talk about like what this work means in terms of black people? And I would always kind of have to switch it, like when I get up in the morning, I don't go, oh my God, there's a black woman in the mirror, and I can't represent all black people either. And so that it is about my experience, and it's about a collective experience. But in some ways, in this short history of what we call America, we are all in it together. So my history and my experience is also very an American experience. And race, on a certain level, although there is a lot of division even at this moment, we are all implicated in what all of that means. So, in that way, it was an interesting point in my career, which I've gotten to the point now, that's a jump, that, you know, I stopped reading reviews of my work just because I was at such, I would say reviews are, it caused me to do two things. I would not read reviews. I would only talk to friends about the work that I was making or fellow colleagues in terms of curators and other artists and kind of academically. But I also became very, this is like, now I'm just talking to artists. I was very, very cautious about who I invited to write about the work. because I realized if I handed that responsibility to other, like to a gallerist, or wasn't really keen in terms of having concise conversations with curators, it would always end up that I become the bad person who had to kill the piece of writing because it wasn't very good, and like I couldn't sit with having that as part of the writing that I prepared about the work. So there, again, it's the public and the private things that I was personally involved in. I'm very keen about who writes about the work because it's an interesting conversation that will last, and that's why books are important. But there have been many occasions where I've had to kind of step away or kind of decline the offer of certain writings because I felt it wasn't in concert for what I thought the context of the work was. While at the same time, I do very much invite conversations where, certainly with colleagues and academics and people that I know, that brings to my attention things that I would not have thought of. So I don't mean to sound like I'm a control freak, that there's only one narrative about the work, but certainly there has to be an opportunity for openness and an interesting dialogue about the work for that to work. So that's the work from kind of the early 80s into the 90s with this figure. And in some ways the work shifts, which there's a lot of work, so I'm kind of shifting now to 2000s. But still, in some ways, I don't so much anymore, although I play with photography a lot. It started getting me also interested in kind of found photography. So like I collect photographs like crazy, and either from eBay or buying things at auctions and stuff. And so I do kind of, in terms of the value of an archive, I find photography really interesting for the way vintage photographs or old photographs, how they can be repurposed, what their meaning is, and how that meaning shifts over time. So this is a piece called 1957-2009 that I made that just began with buying one photograph on eBay. And that one photograph is of a black woman leaning up against a car. Of course, I don't have the photograph here in this thing, but one photograph of her in a very tight sweater, leaning up against the car, and it looks like the late 50s. And I thought, how interesting is that image? So I bought it and kind of like, well, I'll just add that to the collection. And the seller came back to me and said, well, I have like 3 or 4 albums of photographs just like that, not really family photo albums, but photographs of this woman kind of posing. Are you interested? And I was like, sure. So I buy them, and it is this amazing archive of all these images of this woman and a man as though they are performing for the camera, and it says, it's like from between June and August of 1957 in Los Angeles. And so the aspiration seems to be that of a model or a pinup or maybe even an acting career. And there are these scenarios in a very kind of Cindy Sherman way that they are playing for the camera, this whole performance. So I unpack all these images and I decide, let me, they were so overwhelmingly beautiful and kind of concise, because this is also, like, I think of Dorothy Dandridge, I think of Billie Holiday, like, I just think of, the lives of performers, particularly in the United States, as actors and singers and entertainers, and Jim Crow, and kind of not the ability to kind of travel and stay in places, and that this ambition was actually to be a performer, to have this desire to be part of that arena, and acting it out in the confines of one's home. So I pin them all up, and it takes me about, I think, 6 months to figure out, like, okay, so this is really good, and if you're just gonna like hang them up and present them as an archive, that would be an interesting piece, because it seems that they weren't, there's a lot of study and repetition in kind of the shots and in the posing that I thought was really interesting. But then I decided I have to sometimes take myself out of my own work and go, well, if I were in a graduate school teaching and I saw somebody put this up, what advice would I give them as the next move? Because I think in my own practice I get kind of like, well, I don't do that, so I'm not going to do that. And I do have this ability to kind of look at it and go, well, what would be really interesting as a doppelganger is to pretend to be her, and all this repetition of poses and scenes and fiction that it invites in order to honor this project is to expand it. So I then, kind of with the help of my daughter, who was at that time, I don't know, 2009, I should be able to figure that out. Maybe she was like around 10. And trying to pose for the camera in the same way that she's posing, which was kind of a nightmare and kind of like a yoga class, because she's double jointed, she's kind of got longer limbs than I do, and to do it backwards, because I was shooting with a 2 1/4, so I had to get my daughter to be able to read on the back of the ground glass, read backward to instruct me how to pose the correct way. It just was I was evil and I was angry during the entire project. Because I hate being in front of the camera anyway. So like the idea, that was the first thing, like, okay, get over yourself. I know you hate, I love being behind the scenes. I hate being in front of the camera. But it was quite an interesting lesson for me as an artist, because it was also the thing, like, not making art has to be comfortable. It doesn't have to make you happy. It doesn't have to be comfortable. It can make you nervous, pissed off, and also you go into the studio with whatever it is you have that day. So the figure on the upper left is me. The one on the bottom left is also me. I also play the male character as well. So this is her playing chess. It's me playing chess, trying to copy that. That's the male character. Same thing, that's me pretending to be him. And so on. And what's funny, like I have, of course, you know, being an artist, you have all these people in your lives that are creative. So there was another woman who did hair and prosthetics for film, and another friend of mine that does hair and makeup. So we kind of did it all in the studio. And, you know, in order to do that, let's say, you know, I've sat for hours for them to kind of create their magic, but then when I went into the bathroom to check how I looked, I was like, oh my God, I look just like my father, which was like shocking to me. I mean, I know I look like my father, but I really look like my father. So he had passed maybe at that point, like 5 or 7 years before that. So I still, like, in my studio, like tucked away, like this huge portrait of him that I had for his memorial service. So I pulled it, like it was not far from where it's like on the other side of the room. So I pull it out, and they're both like, my father was Jamaican and Cuban, and the 2 women I was working with are also Jamaican. So I pull that out, and they're like, okay, now you gotta stop, because you're conjuring your father, and he's gonna be up in here, and he's gonna come through you, and we just need to get through this shoot, so like just put that back, turn it around, put it back. But it was really kind of uncanny. So that was a kind of nice moment, because it was also with women who kind of understood the mythology of the kind of Cuban-Jamaican thing. And at the same time, this kind of slippage of gender kind of just brought to life a whole nother side of who I am, which is really, was very interesting. So there are like over 300 photographs in this, and part of the thing of like walking through, again, with this experience of seeing photography is like I am just sprinkled through there. So it takes you a while, because there's so many repetitious photographs of both the male and the female characters out of the original set of images. As you begin to notice that I'm in there. So therefore, it becomes this project that is expanded, because I did the same thing. I spent the summer doing these photographs of imitating them as this kind of performance for the camera as well. And so there comes a point, like that project took, I think, like maybe about 8 or 9 months over the course of time. Made it and kind of ending up in this kind of 300 some odd image installation. But going back to the image that you saw with the chess, I was just like, that was really interesting. Like, I want to do one more thing with this project in terms of this kind of doubling and pretending to be other people and performing for the camera. And in that time, I found this image on eBay, which is a cyanotype of kind of trick photography from the turn of the century, and really kind of love the carefulness in kind of how poised it is that she's taking a picture of herself. So in this kind of turn-of-the-century trick photography, I also came across, well, that's not true. I knew of this image by the Duchamp and Picabia version of this. That's taken by the same photographer. So every time, which again, being in conversation with other curators and other artists, everyone would say to me like, yeah, I like Duchamp's 5-way portrait. And I was just like, no, I'm not doing the 5-way portrait. Yeah, I know, Duchamp, I know. Which is exactly like this. But then I was in conversation with this woman that just, and I can't remember the name of the artist right now, but there was a show at MoMA where an artist used their photography collection as part of their installation. And this image, like she had just gone there, taken a snapshot of this image as it was hanging in MoMA, and said, oh, but have you seen this image? And so she showed, it was like, okay, a black man instead of, okay, I was like, okay, now I gotta use it, okay. So I kind of, this is a trick that's done with mirrors in that you have this 5-way portrait that is not symmetrical, doesn't go back in time like the Hitchcock mirror into or Yayoi Kusama infinity mirror thing. It's a very kind of 45-degree angle or so position of mirrors that kind of gives the illusion that there are these very similar people sitting at the same table. So that's me getting the, and that's kind of the set in the studio of where I decided in using the chess part of it that I'd have these two characters, the male and the female character, playing chess against one another. And so to do that, and this is kind of the way that it gets shot, for a video piece called Chess. And so on one side, you have this male character playing chess and a female character. And they are kind of playing against one another. So it's a 3-part installation. And part of my thing was, I was fascinated and kind of also grew up. I could never learn chess. My dad was a big chess player, and he would try to explain the game to me, and I'd be just like, what? I never got it. But interesting in the sense that it's this game of playing against oneself in terms of moves and anticipating scenarios and kind of a sequencing of moves in order to build your skills. And thought that that's a really interesting way to kind of talk about how these characters may get through life and kind of this interior dialogue that happens when one is playing chess against oneself. It then also, it became a collaboration with Jason Moran because in all this mirroring, I asked him to create a composition where the way he was playing the piano was in the form of mirroring, that the hands, you know, generally it's ambidextrous and you can kind of do all these different things with one hand, but that somehow the melody and kind of the way that it is composed, everything is in unison, which is something also exercises out of Bach. So he created this really beautiful composition to go with live, actually, in the studio to go with the piece. So hopefully in the next, oops, I'm going backwards. And this is chess. And so this is a 3-part installation. So in some ways, this is kind of a compilation of those screens. So they are actually playing a real game. Since I don't know the real game, I had to, the moves had to be called out to me. So some with the acting through it is like, oh, that's a pawn. Okay. And this is the composition by Jason Moran. So during the kind of the scope of this piece, which is, I guess, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, the characters age over the course of the video. They get older and older. So it's this game that they're playing and they're aging as they play. So also with chess, I mean, that piece, just to go back to chess for a minute, what's interesting to me also in the performative side, with all these kind of heterosexual normatives about, you know, she's the muse, he's the artist, she's very sexy, he's really smart, he poses in front of art or at the guitar, she just poses. And in some ways, a kind of super highlight and kind of really break that down as this performance of a fiction in some ways, because you really don't know who she is or who he is, and somewhat by the nature of the portfolio, it is all a construction, that they were this kind of construction for the camera. So there's this entire, I imagine it as this project for them, that their entire lives are kind of off to the side in a way. So the portfolio of images don't really speak to or talk about them other than a visage, other than a construction, because I really don't know who they are or what their lives were like, only that it was 1957 and that it's in the summer and that there's a performance taking place. So I started then making collages and drawings from another piece kind of around 2012, 2013, and using Ebony and Jet magazines as my source material. And that kind of started from a child, and my mother was from Chicago, and kind of visiting Chicago a lot, but also in our home in Brooklyn and in Queens, there's always, you go to a friend's house, there's always an Ebony magazine or a Jet magazine in those households. So it was in finding some that were my grandmother's a few years ago, I was like, that's really interesting. I just kind of sat one afternoon looking through them, and I was not only interested, of course, in the editorials about politics and, of course, entertainment, sports, and kind of the news of the day and celebrities, but how much of a lens Ebony magazine was in terms of kind of Black culture as a way to talk about what was going on kind of in the United States, but also in the world. And so that I found really fascinating, but also then the ads that are kind of throughout it, and kind of Ebony's rise was really that Johnson Publishing at a certain point early in, like maybe by the 1940s, got national ad companies to make black ads for a black audience in their magazines, and that really was the foundation in which they were able to sustain but kind of become a widely circulated magazine. So a lot of what I play with are images out of ads, not so much famous figures that come out of that, or editorial images, kind of using models, so kind of unknown or underknown people who are kind of posing. And so that kind of led into a whole series of using photographs and collages in a way that I hadn't used faces before, but kind of playing with faces and kind of with these inks and washes as ways of defining hair. These are kind of before and after ads, which I find fascinating in Ebony magazine because it's like makeup and no makeup, attitude and happy. So, and also feels like, as you look through, like the late 60s, 70s, there's a consternation on the face of these before photos, kind of like the faces we have right now, about what's going on. And then there's like this happy face. And I always find it interesting because the women don't look particularly, like the woman on the left doesn't look bad than the same person on the right, but it's more this kind of attitude thing. And I thought it was very interesting that the beauty ads have something more to do with what's going on in one's mind, or like this array of like headache ads, and the way that that's described and pictured, I find fascinating. So let's go through these. So one of the books that was just released this past spring is a book of collages with Chronicle Books. And kind of using all kinds of source material. Like this is a geological book from the turn of the century with these illustrations of different kinds of minerals. And then ebony faces, mostly from wig ads, are kind of collaged in. So it's been in terms of the scope of the work and kind of, I think there was a point, because I've done maybe 7 or 8 video works. Like there was a point in my career where I kind of felt just traveling all the time and wanting to kind of create a practice that I could just make something out of anything without having to pick up a phone, plan 3 months ahead, or plan with the printer, like just some way of also working and kind of creatively stretching my imagination and even my practice in a way that was much more intimate, that didn't require getting on a plane or making plans or a whole kind of production thing. So the works on paper kind of brought that, a different kind of flexibility, and certainly, which also kind of then started playing with these photo collages, like very crudely, going, I guess, back to my, crude graphic design days of these images that were already surreal from the beginning and just adding like one element. So they're very one-note ponies, but in a way, interesting way to play with this archive of photography, of photographic images that I'm constantly collecting. Yeah, there's this whole thing about deers. You got deers here, right? You have deers in this state? No, not really. I don't know, there's this whole thing about people domesticating deers like pets, which is kind of, I can't imagine that personally, but there's a ton of images like that out there. And so there's, what's interesting, I guess, about my practice now that's also not only photography and this collage work, but also painting, and the kind of collages have started this entry into painting because I was doing the collage work and it's all very small, and knowing a lot of amazing painters that are personal friends for many years, it's a little intimidating, to ask, a friend of yours that's a really famous painter, like, so where do you get those made? How do you do that? Like, who do you go to do that? But I always kind of work very much in public there is this thing that like the work that I make, there's never like, oh, never really shown that. Oh, those I've kept for myself. I make something and it is out there, and it's kind of always been, so I don't have a sentimental attachment to the work. I mean, I think there's works that I like, but it has always been I make it and then it's kind of in the public before I can even say I've completely figured things out, which I guess at this point it's been really interesting because being uncomfortable is a great state to be in, that I feel discomfort in making the work or I feel unsure about the work, and there isn't a point like, oh, I got that, that's nailed. Like, okay, make that done, next one. There's always this level of uncertainty that I quite enjoy. So I was kind of invited, sort of, by Okwe and Wazor, who was curating the Venice Biennale a few years ago. And why I say wasn't really invited is like, he was like, oh, so give me a proposal. So although we're very close, our daughters are like sisters, he was still like, but I need a proposal from your ass. Which I complied. I mean, you know, many kinds of relationships that are like professional and personal, and to observe the professional. And so I kind of had taken the summer off and kind of was experimenting with these kind of images and painting, and showed him a couple of things. He goes, oh, this is really interesting. I was like, so can I get in? And he was like, make a couple more. So it was like, it was this weird conversation. I was like, okay, just say you don't like them and we can be done. But I think I was very persistent and I begged and I was like, oh, come on, you know these are gonna be great, even though I hadn't finished all of them. But he finally accepted my proposal, so to speak. So I had these new images, which are kind of based on collages that I had made, and kind of these images culled from Ebony magazine for Venice, which, you know, before that point, like maybe a year from that, I was like thinking about painting, but I had studied painting in undergraduate school. So it wasn't completely foreign to me, but it was a huge risk. Like, yeah, go to Venice, show some paintings, and what if that's bad, you know? But they were very well received, actually, to my surprise, and it was a very kind of gutsy in the sense of I was literally just figuring it out painting by painting. It's called Nightmare, of using the collages as a way in terms of to enter into the subject matter of painting and kind of how to paint them and what would those images look like, but how do they operate? So to me, they're like big drawing kind of painting things. And so there's silk screen, some of it's silk screen, some of it's painted by hand. It's like a woman coming in one direction, but her head is on backwards, and so on. So a whole nother way of course, a lot of these images are also photographically based, but using washes of ink. So the material is like they're on panels, but they have these washes of ink. So I've kind of stayed within the medium of the collages as ink as this medium of drenching these canvases in a way with ink that have photographic images printed on them. So yeah, this was from a show in Fort Worth a couple of years ago. And so it also, I mean, I've done installation work and more sculptural works, like mostly in the 90s, and kind of pulled away from that, but have kind of re-entered into that. So as you can see with maybe these images of kind of these ice formations and figures, and then kind of creating this illusion of ice with these blocks of glass, kind of having glass fabricated to look like ice. So this is called Missing Film. It's an old film canister that has this film about Black history that is missing, with this ice sitting on top. And ebony magazines and stacks with ice. So this is from my show in London this past year, which I can't believe it, past spring at Hauser and Wirth in London. So it's been interesting, and that exhibition actually gave me, these are some of the collages that were part of that exhibition. in a way of like, when I work on all these different things at the same time. I like, some days, for a few days in a row, I'll be working on paintings or a few weeks, and then I'll stop and do a bunch of collages, or I'll do collages for a few hours. But it's really nice way of working, and also to be able to create exhibitions that combine somewhat the practice that happens in the studio. Because for me, there's a thread. I mean, I'm kind of working on all these things at the same time, so therefore, to me, just that practice in itself has a thread, but certainly kind of the details of ice and kind of existing in these inhospitable environments as a kind of backdrop for the subject of these paintings kind of permeates the photo collages, but also the paintings. Yeah, that's surreal, like all I did was change the head. That is actually a photograph of a giant snowball with a woman on top. And this is in Switzerland, the kind of making of the snowball and the clay head to arrive to that. So kind of using that photograph as a basis for a sculpture and the kind of absurdity of it. So I have a show coming up, so I'm busy in the midst of making work now. And it's so interesting to be, because this is my first time in Houston, but having visited, of course, Texas before, other cities, but kind of just going to museums. I mean, as an artist, it's so nice to go look at art without a purpose, just to look and to kind of absorb things. So it's been a really great day today of going to the fine institutions that you have here and kind of just soaking it up for my own sake as an artist. And that's a view in the studio of some of the paintings getting done. I think I'm almost at the end. So there was one more element, and this is a piece called Montage, where from the Ebony and Jet magazines, I kind of called these AP photographs, and I think an editorial image of like a woman laying on a bed. I don't know if it was for like depression or actually an advertisement for headaches. But there's a woman standing on a ledge, and then there's this woman laying in a bed, and the kind of precariousness of, in this juxtaposition, dream state or waking state, like it's kind of the same person, but different states of being. One as being asleep but not asleep, or dreaming about being on a ledge, or actually being on a ledge and dreaming about laying in a bed. And those are details from that. And studio paintings in progress. The end.